When markets in September of 2022 panicked, five-year bond yields for Britain spiked higher than those of Greece or Italy. The pound sterling hit a historic low against the dollar. This was not an external shock. It was a self-inflicted wound by British statecraft that chose short-term financial gains over long-term resilience. Today we examine how this structural decay turned a former superpower into an economy as vulnerable as Mississippi, driven by incentives rather than ideology. The narrative that Brexit broke the United Kingdom is a convenient scapegoat for politicians on all sides. It ignores 6 decades of strategic drift where leaders prioritized London's financial services over industrial resilience and energy independence. This strategy created an economy so fragile that when global shocks hit, whether the 2008 crash, the pandemic, or the Ukraine war, the country had no structural shock absorbers left. The result is not a temporary dip in GDP, but a convergence with regional economies like Mississippi, a wealthy nation on paper, structurally hollowed out by decades of underinvestment and reliance on credit bubbles rather than productivity growth. To understand this decline, we must look past the 4-year political cycle and examine the identity crisis that has plagued British strategy since the 1960s. Dean Acheson famously noted 60 years ago that Britain had lost an empire but never found a new purpose. It remained adrift as a middle power attempting to execute superpower policies without the corresponding industrial base or energy security to support them. This oscillation between global ambition and domestic reality has left British statecraft unable to commit to a coherent long-term plan, making it reactive rather than strategic whenever a crisis emerges. The foundation of this fragility was laid during what many recall as an economic golden age from 1998 to 2007. Under Gordon Brown, the UK experienced annual GDP growth rates between 2 and 3%. However, this boom was not driven by genuine industrial expansion or productivity gains. Instead, it was a mirage sustained by unsustainable credit levels and revenue generated solely from banking taxes that masked underlying structural rot. The state effectively borrowed against its future to fund current consumption, creating a false sense of security about the economy's health while allowing critical infrastructure to atrophy. Quick resource note. I keep a curated set of Amazon search links in the description for books, gear, and tools relevant to this channel's topics. Some are affiliate links, so I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you. Please consider supporting the channel by using those links if you find something useful. When the 2008 financial crash finally burst this bubble, the strategic response was to double down on austerity rather than investment. Chancellor George Osborne chose fiscal consolidation over borrowing to fund productivity-enhancing infrastructure. By cutting public spending to balance books, the government starved critical sectors including transport networks, green energy transitions, and worker retraining programs for a decade. This is akin to eating your seed corn. You can harvest more today by consuming what was meant to plant next year's crop, but the result is guaranteed poverty in the future. The decision to prioritize debt reduction over capital investment ensured that when new shocks arrived, there were no physical assets or skilled workforces left to absorb them. The consequences of this structural weakness became undeniable during the attempted recovery efforts of 2022. Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng introduced a growth plan inspired by US-style deregulation and unfunded tax cuts, essentially trying to copy-paste Reaganomics onto an economy that lacked the domestic scale to support it. The market reaction was immediate and severe. 5-year bond yields surpassed those of Greece and Italy within days, signaling a loss of confidence in British solvency. Prime Minister Liz Truss resigned after only 6 weeks because her administration attempted policies designed for massive domestic markets like the US on an economy too small and vulnerable to absorb the shock without catastrophic consequences. This failure highlights a critical distinction between large continental economies and smaller open ones. The UK's reliance on the City of London as its primary economic engine left regional industries exposed to global price swings while lacking their own industrial base. When energy prices spiked following geopolitical tensions, the country had no domestic green infrastructure or diversified manufacturing to fall back on. The post-Brexit estrangement from EU energy markets exacerbated this vulnerability, leading to a situation where inflation in neighboring Eurozone regions directly spillovered into British households at rates exceeding 9%. The comparison to Mississippi is not an insult, but a structural parallel. Both are resource-rich regions that failed to diversify their industrial base against global price shocks due to over-reliance on a single sector or external funding mechanisms. In the American South, this often manifests as reliance on agriculture and energy exports without sufficient value-added manufacturing. In Britain, it is the reliance on financial services and foreign capital flows without domestic production capacity. When those external factors turn volatile, both regions suffer similar declines in living standards because they lack the internal economic diversity to buffer against external shocks. The strategic implications extend beyond economics into national security and global influence. As Britain's industrial base eroded, so did its leverage in transatlantic discussions regarding major powers like China or Russia. Military cuts and a diminished special relationship have reduced London's ability to shape outcomes independently. Washington now views the UK as peripheral rather than central because it lacks its own economic and energy backbone. A state cannot project power if it is dependent on others for basic stability, forcing American planners to look elsewhere for reliable partners in an era of great power competition. The lesson here is not about which political party was right or wrong, but about the incentives that drive strategic choices over decades. Leaders consistently chose short-term financial gains and debt-fueled consumption because it delivered immediate results before elections, rather than investing in physical infrastructure that takes years to yield returns. This pattern reveals a universal truth of statecraft. When states prioritize paper wealth over productive capacity, they become vulnerable to external shocks regardless of who holds the gavel. The UK's stagnation serves as a case study for how soft structural failures can harden into permanent economic decline faster than any single election result could cause. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I am a one-person team working hard to make each video better than the last. Subscribe if you found value. It is the best way to show support. Drop a comment with your biggest takeaway. See you in the next video.